all of these different content pieces are used when you do go into the classroom. And as a faculty member, you tend to put on a number of different roles or put on a number of different hats. You're a teacher, you're a scholar, you're an administrator, but you could also think of yourselves as designers. You take these content pieces and design them in such a manner to present to your students. And one of the things that we've tried to do is have faculty members be designers without having to learn the technology behind creating content to put online for students. So there are all these different content pieces, and typically they get presented in a very linear fashion in class, and then during lecture you try and make connections and bring in outside pieces of information. More images, more audio, more text. And so students are able to see all of these connections between different types of content pieces. The typical vehicle for taking all of these content pieces and presenting them in class is PowerPoint. Something very easy to use, it's flexible, but what happens after class is these tend to get turned into PDFs. It's not changing. And then thrown up on a course management system like WebCT or a Blackboard Vista. So we found that this is a bit problematic. Faculty members have lots of content, text, video, images, audio, but often they're presenting it to students in a very linear, disconnected fashion because they're limited by the technology that is available to them at this point. So it seems somewhat at odds with how we teach as educators and how students learn and how we utilize technology. So we started trying to think about what faculty members really need. And in a sense, it's a sort of better book, something that makes material a lot more malleable, something that appeals to the number of visual learners that we have coming to our campuses, something that maximizes class time, and something that allows students to have more ownership over their learning. So in 2005, the Arts and Sciences Honors Program received a Davis Educational Foundation grant. And the purpose of this grant was to enable or support more technology in a humanities program. And part of this grant allowed us to create scalable resources for repurposing. So creating applications that could be used within the honors program, but also could be used across campus. It also enabled us to hire a resident instructional designer who is devoted to the honors program and also a graduate web assistant who is devoted to the honors program. So as we were starting to think about what resources faculty members needed to help build this better book, we started thinking of requirements that would be needed. So we needed something that was web-based, that was multi-platform use, that could be a small file size so students wouldn't have to sit at their computer and watch the loading screens and the little ball spin and spin and spin. It also needed to support various formats. So it needed to be able to present text, images, audio, and video. It also needed to be able to allow faculty members and students to make relationships among the content that was being presented. It needed to be flexible enough where faculty members could create something that was very directed and very linear, but also allow students to take a sort of nonlinear approach to their own learning. And it also needed to have keyword searching. So for the interface, we wanted something that was user-driven so that students would have the ability to go where they wanted to go in the site, and also something that had very clear navigation, because if it wasn't easy to navigate, students and faculty members weren't going to use it. So we had two case studies or case prototypes that we were basing this project on, and both of these were presented at last year's eTeaching Day. The first one was a project which we just called the Rome Project, but the official name is Roma Caput Mundi. This was developed in our office, and the faculty member behind it was Stephanie Leone in the Fine Arts Department. She had over 500 images that she had taken of Rome and wanted to present them to her students in a way where they could get to know some of the monuments and Rome in a more physical sense. So we created, in a sense, a walking tour of Rome. So this is the main interface. We used a map, and at the bottom you'll see a timeline, and as students scroll over the timeline, different monuments pop up as to when they either were built or renovated. There's also historical information within the timeline if they click on one of the tan bars. When they click on a particular image, it takes them to a description of the monument and then also links out to the photographs. Another prototype project was the Shelley Project, which Mark O'Connor developed. And the purpose of this project was to allow students to have a contextual environment so they could see when Mary Shelley, or the influences Mary Shelley had as she was writing Frankenstein. So this project moves across various types of media. There's a lot of art, there's a lot of video, there's music, there's text, and so we wanted to, I'll show you the interface. There's also the ability to compare a number of objects within this environment. So with these two products, prototypes in mind, we, which were very time intensive in terms of resources that went into creating these projects, we wanted to be able to create something that was a bit more scalable and something that could be reused across the campus. So we developed an application that would be easy for faculty members to use, to maintain, and to present to their students. Again, the purpose of this was to help create something that could be used within the honors program, but which could also be used across disciplines. So the product was an application which we are calling Mimeo, and I'll turn it over to Tim, who's going to discuss some of the features and this application.
So just as when we got comfortable with the name Mimeo, we're going to have to change it eventually, so don't get too attached to that particular name. But the idea was that it was a way for both students and faculty to explore multimedia content. And it was designed by Metaversal Studios, who we hired to do this, and Marie McDowell was working with the honors program to develop this early version of things. And when I took it over, we started working on wrapping the Flash interface in a Drupal HTML wrapper. And again, Drupal is an open source content management system development platform that allowed us to handle some of the more back-end stuff of getting content into Mimeo and then having it display in the Flash interface. So again, I think one of the big things that is useful about this application is the idea of tracing ideas, concepts, content across various media. So we were working with text, audio, images, and video to start with, to allow all these things to coexist in one environment, in one interface. And we also want these things to be, we want to be able to create connections and relationships between the various objects that are there. Could be linear, just grouping things like in the same way you might in a PowerPoint from one thing to the next in a particular order. But we also wanted things to be able to be cross-referenced in a way with tags where things could be grouped in a slightly more organic way, I guess, where things could show up in a lot of other places in the same environment. But then we also wanted the option to have spatial data attached to an object so that it could show up in a map in relationships, spatial relationships with other items. The timeline provides a way to connect dates or other kinds of temporal data and visualize things that way, and then connect it to where, potentially connect it to where it's on the map, so that things on the map might not show up until the timeline is at a particular place where it's relevant. The comparison option allows those things, like Jeanne was saying, to be viewed side by side, so that items could have relationships and be viewed. Here's one thing, let's look at this other thing together and see what relationships we find there. And then, of course, just finding things is going to be important as you allow items to kind of circulate around with various metadata that has them show up in different places in the environment. So finding where things are and using that as a way to explore by keyword was also important. So, you might think about, I guess the way we've been thinking about it is similar to the way the web works. In a way, you have all these digital objects out there floating around and appearing in different places depending on what the interface might be. A blog post could start off in a blog and then get pulled into an RSS feed reader in some other place, and people might be reading those alongside very different kinds of content. Or YouTube videos might get embedded in other kinds of websites. And so the notion of the mashup, where you're pulling in stuff from all over the place, and those items circulate far beyond its original context. I think we're building on that. In this particular context, we have different kinds of items that show up in different places depending on where the metadata is. And this we feel like is part of the educational mechanism that faculty are often doing anyway, and this just provides a mechanism to do that. So I just want to talk a little bit first about what it looks like on the front end, and then we'll talk a little bit about how faculty would work with the content more on the back end to get stuff in. So this gives you a sense of a couple of the different views. You can see there are 4 tabs there that correspond to some of the different views that people can, where people can view items. The item view gives a detail of, say in this case, an image with some text on the side, and the slideshow below groups things. They might be topics or they might be tags, but allows people to view by thumbnails. So if we take a look at this, we can go up. If you click on a particular item and you double click on, this case, an image, you'll get a larger version of it in a pop-up window. And then there is some text on the side that you could put in with some detail about it. You can also put in links that would open in a new window, so you can point out to other content, and then you can scroll through other items in that slideshow. Now, the compare view allows you to take one of these items that you're working with and bring up another item right next to it. Whoops. And so what happens here is you might click on one of the topics on the side. It brings up the first item, and then you're interested in looking at something next to it. So you click the compare button, brings up this other item, and you might look at those together. You might also bring up some music and listen to that next to one of those items, if this may be strategically placed there by the professor for you to listen to those things together. And then you can also move from there to other things by going to the search field and putting in something that okay, there was something in another part of the site. I can't remember exactly what it was, but I think it started with third, brings me to this item, then it brings it up into that frame next to the other item, so you can look at them together. So it gives you a way to sort of make connections one-to-one that way with other items, especially visually. Having them side by side is an important kind of relationship for certain learning activities. Now, tags allow you to, you can apply tags to any item, and it allows you to group things in ways that might be a little more kind of on the fly or less linear. But here, if there's all the items that are tagged Palazzo Barberini will show up here in a slideshow, so you can see those together. And it just provides you lots of ways to have the same items show up grouped in other contexts with other related materials. And down the road, we would like to open that up so that students can also participate in tagging things and making it a little bit more Web 2.0 in that way, that the tags with a particular collection could grow as people use them and start making other kinds of connections. So if a particular item also has map or timeline data, then it will show up on the side here. You can see next to item view is map view, next to slideshow is timeline. And once you go in and start navigating around this interface, you'll see that down below there, when you click on a timeline item, it shows up and allows you to view it in the item view so you can get detailed views of what's in that timeline. And then as you move around, you'll be able to go out and see it as well in the map view. And the same items might be also up in the map view if they have spatial data. But what the timeline can do here is as you scrub along, different things will show up as you get to the relevant dates. So that way, if you're trying to show the progression of, say, a place and how historically different things showed up at different times, you can do that by connecting the map data with that timeline data. And you can go in and navigate around this map, sort of Google Map-like, drag it, zoom in, and then different items, you can click on items or hover over an item to see what it is, and that way you can get a sense of where things are in relation to each other. Once you click on it, it will also bring you back to the item view so you can see what it is. So that's the idea with the map and timeline functionality. And the panels on the side provide large kind of buckets where you can group stuff into topics and have items show up in a kind of linear way. So you might have things that, say you had in a PowerPoint for a particular day that you wanted to have you wanted the students to see in a particular order. You could group them under major topics. That could be a starting point for students to come in and explore, but then they go from there to explore through tags or through the map or the timeline and various things. So I think one thing that's useful here is to think of, what happens to your PowerPoint after the class session in order. Because there's nothing wrong with PowerPoint, of course, but it has a lifetime that in some ways gets locked into your class unless it has a place to go in another format. And I think we're starting to imagine Mimeo as really a way for, in certain cases, for all the multimedia stuff that you present in class, to have that go somewhere where students can return to it afterwards or go to it beforehand and have them be able to work with that same content and make connections as well. So I think it's complementary to what's happening in class, where you present it in a way that has it's a unique presentation that happens then, but it also has a life after class for you and students to keep interacting with it. And finally, the search button here, I just want to point out that if you search for things, it allows you to find that item, to locate that item in whatever context it happens to be in. So if there's metadata that's related to maps, you need to be able to locate that in the map area. So it both lists it in a topic, but also the red triangle here indicates that this is where that item is in the timeline or in the map, and then it's also down here centered in the timeline. So for search to be useful, it needs to also give you locate that item in context wherever it happens to be in Mimeo. So that's basically what the front end looks like. I want to spend a little time talking about more recent developments that we've worked on the back end, because obviously this thing isn't going to be useful if you can't get stuff into it easily. And that's, I think, really one of the keys for us, is making it easy for faculty to gather content and get it in there and organize it the way they want and be able to continue to interact with it, make changes to it without having to have specialized skills. Essentially, if you can upload things using a web form, you're well on your way to being able to work with Mimeo. So what happens is you're giving a username and password. You can log in, and it gives you, say you were had instructor access, it would give you access not only to Mimeo itself, which is in most cases will be password protected, because you probably will have stuff that you may not want to have available to the general public for copyright reasons. So this is sort of way the Mimeo interface looks. But when you go back out, you also have access to ways that you can make changes to your content. So for instance, if you wanted to change your opening blurb from Latin, since most people's Latin is probably pretty rusty, we'll change this to something more intelligible, and this gives you, kind of opening page for people to come in and get a sense of what the project's about. But here it's very similar to a wiki-like interface. You're just going in using the internal editor. And now there are other areas here where you can go in and configure your project from the browser. So you might, change the title to what you want it to be. And generally, if there's a relevant date range for your project, this is where you would put it in and give it a range of what dates are useful for. The timeline knows how to set itself up. And once you hit submit, that will save your content, and then you can move on to other parts of the setup. Now, before we add any items, we're going to want to set up some slideshows. So what we'll do here is this gives you a place where you can add slideshows, and these slideshows are again, the topics that will show up on the left side, and you can just type in the topic here and hit submit. We'll add one more just to have a couple of here that we can work with, and you could also go in and edit these after the fact. So we'll add another one and hit submit. And then once you have a few, you may decide, well, I'd really like to have the new slide show up at the top of that list. So there's a way here that you can go up and sort those slideshows. And to do that, you can just drag that one up to the top and then click submit. And then it's reordered. So we're trying to make that as easy as possible to work with the little drag and drop functionality. And once you have some slideshows, then once you add items, you can tell Mimeo where you want those items to show up in slideshows if relevant. So now the next thing we'll talk about is the base maps. Say you have some base map, you have some reason to put something on a map. You need to get a base map up there so that Mimeo knows where to place stuff. And all you have to do is get a base map, upload it. Here I just have a basic US map. And I pull it in, and your map may not be quite the right size. So in this case, I'm going to crop this map. I just drag the square over the right area so that it fits within the Mimeo interface. In this case, I'm also going to give this map some data, some timeline data. And once I click submit, that map then shows up as an option. Oh, and I needed to refresh this page here so that it shows up cropped properly. So there it is, and now you have a map in there. Now, one thing you can do, in this case, I'm not going to demo this particular functionality, but if you had, say, you wanted a map of Rome at one particular era and then a map of Rome 100 years later, you could have two base maps and give them different timeline ranges. And then as you scroll across the timeline, once you got to the date where that segment of time ended, the other map would be swapped in. So it would be a way to have two different maps that would represent different eras. In some cases, that's relevant for people as they're trying to present the change of something over time, and they want to do that both visually and through the timeline. So next, let's actually look at, okay, we've got our timelines and our maps set up. Let's actually add some content. So I'm going to go ahead and add an image first here. Put in a title. I'm going to put in a couple of tags. And now, so I'm going to add a image of the Ether Monument in Boston. This is kind of my items here are kind of free association. So don't try too hard to make a lot of meaningful connections. Although if you do, they might be interesting. I don't know. So first, I'm starting with the Ether Monument. And I'm not really sure where that came from, but it's there. And I'm going to add it to a slideshow. And then I'm going to give it a year because it was built in 1846. I'm going to put it at that date, and I'm going to put it on the map by dragging the little triangle over to Boston, roughly. And then I'm going to submit it. So now I have my first item. Next, I'm going to go in and I'm going to add a PDF. So I'm going to go, it's pretty much the same process. I go in, I put a title in. In this case, it's an article by Lawrence Lessig. And I go out, browse for the PDF. Pretty standard kinds of way of looking for stuff. I should have cleaned up my desktop before exposing that all to you. But I put in some tags, and I put it in a slideshow, and give it a year. This one's more recent on the other end of the spectrum, 2005. And since Lessig is in Berkeley, I sort of roughly put it around that area. So now we have 2 items. I'll give a couple more just to represent the different types. Let's do audio stream this time. Here we're going back to the 50s, and we'll put in this case a streaming video audio from the Helix server in the library that we use with the library to put stuff up and make available to faculty. And now, finally, I'm going to put on a video stream, also from the Helix server. In this case, Annie Hall, which I just watched this weekend. And you just paste in, again, the link to that slide. Here we'll put it over in New York. And now we have our 4 items. So now what we can do is we can go out and continue. There are a few other things that we'll want to do just to kind of get our site set up. We want to start by, if there's any supplementary material like introduction or bibliography or things that we want to have as sort of contextual material that shows up at links at the top of the page, we can edit these easily here just the way we would edit any other page, and those will show up in whatever order we want at the top once we go into Mimeo. You can also go in and edit your tags if for some reason, you needed to delete something or edit something in case what you really meant was, instead of flowers, you really wanted flower. You could change it there, and then people will add their tags from within from other places, but you can go in and edit it there if you're an administrator. You can also change colors a little bit. We want to give people some ability to tweak their, customize their site. If you really wanted yellow and sort of a kind of a greenish color, you could do that. Or we'd recommend maybe some just solid color that you could use as your basic color scheme. And you could also put up a logo for yourself. If you had a logo made up for your project, you could stick it in this way, and then once you save it, you've got a slightly customized, you don't want to spend a ton of time coming up with a completely new template necessarily, but you want to have something that has a little bit of an identity for your project. So that has changed the site to look a little bit different for your project. So now, finally, let's go out and just take a look at what these things look like in Mimeo itself. So we'll go back. You can see all the content listed here on the side, and you could continue to interact with that stuff outside of the actual Mimeo interface. But if we go in and go into Enter Mimeo itself and look at things that way, whoops, I think we stalled out on this screen. Let me try this again. Okay, so it should go in and show us Mimeo now. So we've got just the 4 items. We've got a couple slideshows to look at. You can go through and look at the Ether Monument in Boston Public Garden. You could look at this PDF. We've got some music here now that you can play, and it will pop up and play. And I hope you're seeing the connections between these. And, of course, Annie Hall. So that will play as it would in WebCT or other kinds of contexts. And then you could see the same stuff in the map view. And it's also on the timeline down below, and it takes you back out to an actual image, and you can then look at tags Ether, for instance, which is connecting them all together in a meaningful way. And there you can see them together in a slideshow. And finally, you could see them, you could compare a couple of things. And then also, one thing that we're working on as a kind of, we're still in development stages, but we've provided a link out to a comment box. So what we'd like to be able to do eventually is provide some other interactions like commenting, or a way that let me just come back to that in a sec. This is the supplementary material here, just so if you want to have some basic stuff to give people an idea of what the site's about and what they can do there, that's what it is. But the idea here would be we have this wrapper that gives you another way to interact with the same content. So we'd like, in the future, we could have that description be a wiki page when you could click on it to edit, and lots of people could edit that description and put things in different places in Mimeo, and it could become more of a collaborative project. And the items could be viewed in one way for part of the class, and then they could be viewed in Mimeo for some other particular purpose. So we want to provide ways to keep evolving, and we can do that by providing multiple interfaces for the same items, and then try to cater to people's particular needs as they go through. So before I hand things over to Mark, just wanted to give sort of a couple scenarios. If you think about, you could be making in-class stuff available outside of class using Mimeo. If you want to take your PowerPoint stuff, put it into Mimeo so that people can go back to it and look at it again. It could also be something that's just supplementary stuff, and then it could be, maybe it's not explicitly covered in class, but you want students to go out and read it. Or it could have a particular assignment that has students go out interacting with it. You present the same material in class, and then they might go back and do something else with it later. So there's lots of ways to sort of move these things in and out of Mimeo and into your classroom experience. So as we mentioned, Mary Shelley was an example of more a topical approach where the slideshows and the topics was the most useful way of grouping things, as well as with tags. Rome integrated things with the map and the timeline, and it was important to have those things working together. There's some other projects in the works where people are working on say, bringing together the notion of improvisation in jazz and having several audio clips, versions of the same song with different improvisational versions of it, and then paired with images of jazz players and readings and all kinds of stuff. So you've got one, you may have one version of it, and then you have everything else that goes along with it, so students can see it all in one place. There's another, Tom Epstein is working on modern art and music, where he's working on Rouault, and bringing in other literature and art that relates to this particular author and allowing students to explore that way. And then another one, Susan Mattis, is working on the Iliad and various eras of art, from classical to neo-modern and neoclassical, and wanting to have all these different scenes together, as well as movies and so forth. So there's a lot of different ways that people might end up using this, and part of what we're doing is now getting ideas of what, the pedagogy now is emerging as people are starting to use it more. Yeah, Crystal?
If I were to use this in my class as a teaching tool, would I have to be connected to the internet?
If you're in Mimeo, you would. Yeah, because it is web-based. So that's something, something to keep in mind. It's different than PowerPoint in that way, because for a lot of PowerPoint, you might not need that. But I want to hand things over to Mark, who's going to talk about housekeeping for the Dürer, this Dürer project, and he's worked. It's a good example of working between lots of different teaching contexts, from working closely with a particular student on one way of interacting with the content, to bringing it into the class, where students might all be on laptops looking at the same instance. In this case, in another case, it was Shelley, where he would be teaching a seminar format and doing this. And so I want him to talk more about the kinds of things he's done with Mimeo and hopes to do in the future. Let me just. There we go. Okay, so which one do you have? Okay.
They're both gone, I guess.
Oh, and I forgot to, I forgot to introduce Will Schenk here. He's been working on the Mimeo project as well as with the honors program in general for the last year, 6 months?
Year. Well, with
Year.
honors, not even.
Yeah. So he's going to drive one monitor, oh, actually both
I
monitors.
guess I'm going to drive both monitors.
Okay, well, thanks. I'm Wyatt here. Can you hear me if I speak like this? It's fine. Just remember I'm Wyatt when you ask your questions. One of the things I would want to do right away by way of start in this brief presentation is to thank IDeS for the involvement they've given the honors program for years. Over the course of the Davis Grant, we've made enormous progress in thinking about ideas across media and how that could be possible in seminars. But that wouldn't have been possible if folks like Jeanne and Tim Lindgren and Rita Owens and Beth Clark and Terry Palucci, all the good folks at IDeS hadn't been so wonderful cooperative right from the get-go. One of the good parts about the project I'm going to be talking about today is its interactivity with students. And so when Will Schenk got introduced, for example, this is a nice moment for me because Will and I shared the seminar table in the late 90s. So he's been brought back to the honors program through the work we've done together. Briefly, when I presented last time, the Variations on the Theme by Mary Shelley, for any of you that were here, you would have heard me say this, that the fundamental problem I was trying to address was just that, how to talk about ideas across media. Moreover, because it's a seminar environment, certain kinds of important intellectual ideas that we have to introduce our bright students to are intractable to conversation. They need more of a lecture build-up, and they also need much more of a in-depth presentation than we can do around the seminar table over the course of a couple of hours. The big problem I was addressing last year was how to get students to understand the change in the notion of the aesthetic, what constitutes the beautiful, what is the notion of the sublime, between roughly 1750 and 1850. And so I used Mary Shelley's Frankenstein as a kind of key moment to make that problem coalesce. You remember in Shelley's text, there is a creature who is in every way superior to his creator, save in one important regard. As the critic Harold Bloom once pointed out, he's ugly. And because he is not beautiful in the standard sense, questions can be raised about the relationship between beauty and goodness and about beauty and the sublime. Using that then as a kind of point out of the curriculum itself, I expanded that to look at the ways in which ideas passed across media around beauty and the sublime between 1750 and 1850. It allowed me to embed texts like Burke or Kant or Schiller on the beautiful and the sublime, and at the same time to create a whole series of images that went over that chronology of roughly 100 years. From, say, on the one hand, starting earlier in neoclassicism with Poussin and taking it all the way through the Géricault physiognomy images, making stops with other folks like Joseph Turner along the way. In doing that, I really had two ideas in mind. I wanted the students to be able to proceed according to what I guess I'd call a vertical grid, a grid that would follow a chronology and allow over time a complicated argument to evolve, and we could watch it become distinctly different. But I also wanted them to think what I guess I would call at the same time horizontally. That is, to think across themes and to create that kind of a Cartesian grid in their brain. The example that Tim used earlier is an interesting moment in that process. Most everything I did was thematically correct. And the example I gave you last year was the Ode Honorati by Jacques-Louis David, and you heard playing at the same time with it Mozart's famous Jupiter Symphony. That's right chronologically, that's right thematically. Just as the beginning of the Jupiter Symphony is separated in ways that in musical terms are called masculine and feminine or martial and lyric themes, so in the same fashion, by the nature of the arches, if you're familiar with the famous David painting, so too are the three principal areas of that painting demarcated in gender terms. It allowed me to talk to one of the key issues in Shelley's Frankenstein from a point of view of gender identity at one particular point in the whole work. The example that was given this time, folks, though, was interesting precisely because it was a good case in point, though Tim perhaps didn't realize this when he chose it, of how this kind of format can also allow you to explore wit in all its multiple dimensions with your bright students. Because the example he chose is The Death of Sardanapalus by Delacroix. You saw that in the background. The music, however, that was playing was La ci darem la mano from Don Giovanni. Chronologically, that doesn't fit. It comes, of course, Don Giovanni comes much earlier, and in fact is linked appropriately with Lectus bearing the bodies of the sons of Brutus in the earlier piece. That's when it should fit and it's thematically right. Why did I choose it out of time like that? Because my students were bright enough and engaged enough by this point to say to me, sick joke, Professor O'Connor. Because, of course, in the painting, Sardanapalus is looking out with his, in his engaged, or rather non-engaged way, at his concubines and everything he holds dear about to be sacrificed before his palace is burned down and everything is destroyed. Well, La ci darem la mano is symbolized in this sense by the hand of one of his slaves coming down with the knife about to enter the very lovely body of that beautiful concubine. That's the sick joke, as it were, that gets the students thinking about what connects and doesn't connect out of a period, what connects in a piece like this, and what's too facile to connect right from the start, that allows you to do more with it than simply make it form. I'd add one more element about that, though. It allowed me to make a very serious point as well. Serious point was this: the music is incandescently beautiful. But if you remember Giovanni, at that point what Don Giovanni is doing is he's seducing Zerlina. Does that make the beauty of the music good or bad? Is it a moral good or a moral evil that this beauty is being put to this purpose? So in a template that was concerned about the very nature of beauty itself, as exemplified in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, that created a different kind of contrafactive moment that I could use well. This kind of possibility then led me this year to explore yet a third way of thinking for my students. Just as I created this kind of Cartesian grid between horizontal thinking and vertical thinking, I also wanted them to add a kind of third dimension to this, and in this case, to render their thinking more profound. I also had a larger scheme in mind. I wanted to pick a topic that could in some ways represent what I think is the value of the honors program we constructed, namely a curriculum that over 4 years allows the students the benefit of recursion, that grows better and better with each year as they return to topics in new ways that they've explored in the past. So that when they looked at the Raft of the Medusa that you saw as one of the examples, and I point out to them that the figure in front is the Ugolino theme, because they have done Dante's Divine Comedy in the first year, everybody knows we're at the 32nd and 33rd canto of Dante's Inferno, and everybody knows that we're dealing with cannibalism, though it's never shown on the raft. That kind of satisfaction of intellectual return can be done in an intensive way by examining what we're seeing today. Albert Durer's Meisterstiche, or his master engravings, that are done roughly between 1512 and 1514, and are virtuosic in every way possible. The first of them is Night, Death, and the Devil. The second is St. Jerome in his Study, and the third, and arguably the most complex image in the Western tradition, is something called Melancholia. What I wanted to do in this case was first to allow the students to improve their eyes. And so in the Mimeo context, what they were able to do was to get a whole series of questions I had scripted, even as I had on the Shelley project, that went from ever more simple to ever more complex ways of looking. So for instance, if we take Night, Death, and the Devil on the close-up here, by looking at it that way, but then by going to embedded text within Mimeo, and going to the hot points that we had put inside that image, my hope was to give them better eyes, to make them look not just globally on all of Durer's engraving, but to see this Meisterstiche in all of its complexity as they went through the quadrants of the engraving itself. And each time they did, to ask them different questions about what they were seeing. By building up their skills on the first of the master engravings, Night, Death, and the Devil, which I would argue has a fairly straightforward interpretation as to meaning, I was this way able to get them prepared for more complicated looking and more complicated interpretation. St. Jerome in his Study offered a first way of doing that, precisely because already, and here Mimeo helps so well, I could go to tropes. That is, in both Night, Death, and the Devil and in St. Jerome and his study, the students would notice right away that there were dogs placed there. Why? I could ask them. What's the purpose? Is there anything symbolic about this? What does it say about the larger image? And they could focus in on each of those in turn. After that, I could get them to think more and more about, say, other images of St. Jerome that Dürer had done and embed those within the Mimeo context as well, again with questions. Why is the skull privileged in Dürer's, for example, oil painting of St. Jerome? How is the skull used instead in the master engraving? And so on. Also, too, I'd add, this builds on things we had done before. We had looked at Holbein's famous Ambassadors, where the skull plays an especially important role, and we're able to think again about how Dürer had, in some ways, established a different kind of issue before Holbein would consider it later in the Renaissance. And now to melancholia, Will, could you take us there?
We've got 3 minutes.
Oh my. All right. Well, in my 3 minutes, just go to melancholia here for a second. And if we had the time, what we would do at this point is I would give you some sense of just what you can do by way of precise looking to complicate questions. Over time, over centuries, melancholia has developed about as many interpretations as just about any written text within the Western tradition. Because that is so, I wanted them to be able to think through those interpretations even as they looked at the picture well, but to see parts of that as they went along. Finally, the last thing I want to say is this. It would not have been possible without the second part of the Davis grant. Because part of it was, of course, to work with IDeS to develop faculty resources. But at least as important with the grant was developing student abilities. And so we constituted, right from the start of the grant, something called Humanities Lab. And out of Humanities Lab and into my seminar came a very bright student named Mike Benton, who's getting on a bus to go home to New Jersey just about now. All last term with me, he worked in an undergraduate research fellowship to think about ways that together he could put his computer science major in tandem with what he was doing with me in seminar. Not only did this open up new possibilities to what computer science could be for him as a discipline, it also at the same time opened up for me possibilities of new ways of seeing as he taught me techniques about flash and flex that I hadn't known before. The last point about what is so good about this process then is, as you well know, the students are often way ahead of us on this. If you find the right student, latch on to her well. Because one of the things you'll find out of that process is that together, the two of you can really create something in its synergies that takes whatever they'll be doing in class and makes them see it in a whole and profound way. Not just Mike, but other members of the seminar took off astronomically because they were working on this together. And again, the last point I'd say is this, that as we worked on variations of the theme by Mary Shelley and actually used it in seminar this year at the beginning of the term, everybody had their laptop open. And I had the LCD projector going. So we were able globally to focus on one piece, but they were able through their laptops to keep working back and forth interactively at the same time. That, to me, constitutes a seminar. Thank you very much. Preacher, who is in every way superior